Hello, my name is Veronica Chapman-Smith. I'm the Vice President of Community Initiatives here at Opera Philadelphia. Thank you for joining us for today's lecture. It is the second of a four-part series done in collaboration with the International Florence Prize Festival. The series is hoping to provide comprehensive exploration of classical music, representation within classical music, showcasing the diverse forces that are often overlooked. Today's lecture is titled Florence B. Price and Marian Anderson, A Story of Sisterly Love, which will use archival materials to focus on the relationship between Florence Price and Marian Anderson. This lecture is being recorded and will be available on the Opera Philadelphia YouTube channel at a later date. Last week's lecture, Reshaping the Vocal Canon, Does Representation Matter, is now available on the Opera Philadelphia YouTube channel. So for those who are interested, we will drop the link in the chat. As I've mentioned, this series is done in collaboration with the International Florence Prize Festival. If you would like to learn more about the International Florence Prize Festival, that is often affectionately called Price Fest as for shortened abbreviated terms, please feel free to use the link that will also be dropped in the chat. They are an amazing organization. We are very thankful to be in collaboration with them. And actually, Dr. Douglas Shadle is a part of the organization himself. So if he would like to speak a little bit about it, he's more than welcome to. But I'm going to introduce him first so that you can all know a little bit more about Dr. Douglas Shadle. He is an associate professor of musicology at the Vanderbilt University Blair School of Music, an award-winning historian of American orchestra and orchestral music. He is an author of 2 books published by Oxford University Press, Orchestrating the Nation and the 19th Century American Symphonic Enterprise, and Anthony Dvorak's New World Symphony. A co-founder, director of the International Florence Prize Festival. He is also co-authoring a Price biography for Oxford Master Musician Series. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Shadle to the Zoom room and to this wonderful lecture. We will also drop a link to Dr. Shadle's university webpage so you can get some more information for those who are interested. Thank you very much and welcome, Dr.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just going to share screen here quickly so that we can get started on the presentation, and that will take me just a moment. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Coming at you from Nashville, where it's still morning. So if you are not on the East Coast, good morning still. And of course, thanks to all of you for being here. It's a real pleasure to present for an organization with the high level of creativity and inclusivity that Opera Philadelphia is known for. This is an organization that's been, they may not know it, very close to me for a long time, because one of my former students, the composer Renee Orth, was composer in residence for a while at Opera Philadelphia in the mid-2010s, and so it's just been a real pleasure to be involved with that organization more directly. And of course, a special thanks to Veronica Chapman-Smith and her staff colleagues at Opera Philadelphia for making this collaboration with the International Florence Prize Festival such a meaningful experience. The 4 lectures, I think, are really terrific, and it's just very exciting to play a part in that series. So as Veronica mentioned, my name is Doug Shadle, and I'm an associate professor of musicology at Vanderbilt University here in Nashville. I'm also a founding director of the Prize Festival, but I have to say it's a little funny that I'm giving this lecture today for 2 reasons. First is that I'm not an opera scholar. Most of my research, as Veronica mentioned, is on the history of American orchestras, but I do love opera. It's just not my core work. Now, the second odd reason for me to be here is that the composer Florence Price wrote about 400 pieces of music, but not a single opera. And maybe that means that we should just pack it up and call it a day, because I will not be talking about opera. However, I think that the topic is important for the audience of Opera Philadelphia and the other partners of Opera Philadelphia and other interested individuals. to learn about this subject because Florence Price and her relationship with the great contralto Marian Anderson is tailored specifically to a Philadelphia audience. And so part of what I'm doing today is going into a bit of granular detail about something that's relevant for Philadelphia, even if it's not directly related to opera. And so I'm grateful to Opera Philadelphia for allowing me to share this hyper-localized topic. Now, Philadelphia, of course, is known as the city of brotherly love. The Greek word philos, which is the first half of Philadelphia, suggests a kind of family love, one in which the individuals feel duty-bound to one another in a relationship of mutual support, that it's a kind of unquestioned love. But the Greek root of the second half of Philadelphia, adelph, is ambiguous. Completed one way, and it means brother, but completed another way, because Greek is a gendered language, it means sister. So Philadelphia very well could and should be equally the city of sisterly love, the city of sibling love. Now, I begin with this observation because the thesis of my talk is that Florence Price and Marian Anderson's relationship is perfectly encapsulated by the word Philadelphia. It was a type of sisterhood, and in this case, specifically Black sisterhood, marked by unquestioned mutual support. Now, in this line of argumentation, I'm following Dr. Alicia Lola Jones of the University of Cambridge, who has written that Anderson's support of Price provided what she calls a musical rebuttal to the exclusionary classical music industry. Now, I also followed Dr. Samantha Agee of the University of Southampton, who has written extensively about what she calls the hand of Black women's fellowship that animated Price's compositional career. So while the framework of this argument owes a significant debt to Dr. Jones and Dr. Agee, what I'm bringing to the table here this afternoon is a more granular analysis of archival documents that will help demonstrate the profound reality of their sisterly relationship. It's one thing to take a 10,000-foot view and show how these individuals were working together, but we're going to take a very close, granular look at how this relationship manifested. Now, I first visited the Central Archive of Florence Price documents at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville in May of 2016, which was only a few months after it opened for scholarly research. Some of you on the call may know that in 2009, a lot of Florence Price documents were found in this old house in central Illinois that used to be Price's summer home, and it was really miraculous that they were discovered, and so they became available for people to look at in the summer of 2015, and it was a few months later that I was able to go and spend about 2 weeks of sustained time. Now, over the past 8 years, I've returned to this archive and looked at these materials through various different lenses and have come to know them very well. Now, in February of 2022, so not that long ago, I spent a significant time with the Marian Anderson papers held at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And there I was able to tie together a lot of biographical threads that had remained open for me in the intervening years. There isn't a lot of Anderson stuff among the Price materials in Arkansas, but there is a lot of Price stuff with the Anderson materials in Philadelphia. And so you can kind of put some puzzle pieces together there. And this presentation today is my first public reveal of that work. And so I'm really glad to be able to do that. And I'm also very interested in questions and feedback. So with that background in mind, I want to begin in earnest at the end of this story. In an undated letter written about 10 years after Florence Price died, her daughter, confusingly also named Florence, but she had the last name Robinson. That was her married name. So Florence Robinson wrote Marian Anderson the following letter. She wrote, "Dear Miss Anderson, my family has been deeply grateful to you for including Mother's music on records, in recital, and radio and TV. Next year, part of the money from the royalties on the records will be used to pay my niece's college tuition. I shall also set some aside for my 6.5-year-old son and 8-year-old nephew's future college days. Sincerely yours, Florence. Now, here we can see in this short letter that the creative sisterhood that Price and Anderson developed while Price was still alive helped all 3 of Price's grandchildren go to college, meaning that the tangible intergenerational impact of this relationship was enormous. Robinson's son, Lawrence, the 6.5-year-old mentioned here, eventually studied engineering at Northwestern in Evanston. It's had a significant effect on their lives. Now, another letter written about 2 years later shows a more personal side to this relationship. Mrs. Robinson wrote, "Dear Miss Anderson, I can't begin to tell you how much your singing has meant to me, but this Christmas it had a very special meaning for me. A few months ago, I had a very serious operation. Since my condition is critical and I do have to have additional surgery next month, this Christmas seemed quite important to me. I am glad to be alive. We were invited to Christmas dinner and your Christmas recordings were played. I'm sure that you'll understand the joy I felt. Yours truly, Florence Price Robinson." Now here we see a much more emotional, heartfelt expression of what Anderson and Price's relationship meant to her family. The first letter could be viewed as a bit transactional, or at least professional, while the other is much more personal. We can get the sense that Anderson's recordings helped Mrs. Robinson endure her difficult health situation, and that she was just glad to be alive and experience that music one more time. Now, reading these letters for the first time raised many questions for me. How did Marian Anderson's work with Price come to have such a profound impact on her daughter? Now, of course, to answer that question, we need to dial back the clock even farther and discuss how Price and Anderson's relationship started. So we began at the end, but now we'll dial the clock back. So I'll do that by introducing a little background on each person, meaning Price and Anderson, before we dive into their collaboration. So who was Florence Price? This is a quick overview. She was born Florence Beatrice Smith in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1888. And she was the daughter of a prominent dentist named Dr. James Smith and a school teacher, again, confusingly named Florence, but Florence Irene Smith. There are a lot of Florences in this family. Now, perhaps it goes without saying, but you can see from the timeline that Jim Crow laws were immediately on the horizon after Price was born. We tend to think of Jim Crow laws coming into focus in 1890-91. And these put her family in a relatively precarious situation after they had become relatively prosperous through Dr. Smith's dental practice during and after Reconstruction. Now, Price was exceptionally intelligent and musically gifted, perhaps even a child prodigy, for she was performing already around the age of 4 and completed high school at the age of 15. Now, because finding advanced musical instruction was difficult for students of color in the Deep South, Price's family chose to send her to Boston's New England Conservatory, which had a fairly sturdy history of enrolling students of color, though not without some pushback from Southern white families, which Price also experienced while she was there. Now, nevertheless, Price finished 2 diploma programs after only 3 years, was I think the only student, I'd have to double check this, but I think was the only student that year to complete 2 programs, and then moved back to Little Rock in 1906, where she pursued a career as a music teacher at segregated academies, as well as for a short time at Clark College in Atlanta, which is now Clark Atlanta University. Price married an attorney named Thomas Jewell Price in 1912, and for the next 15 years, taught piano privately and eventually began raising her 2 daughters, Edith and Florence, this one who wrote the letters later, and helped manage their family. But her life changed dramatically in the mid-1920s. Now, in the first place, she began composing larger works in earnest and even entered some of these compositions in contests, which she ultimately won. So she was a very successful composer at the very start of her career. Now, simultaneously, she returned to advanced musical study in Chicago and began solidifying her professional networks there in 1926 and 1927. But in 1927, however, a brutal lynching in Little Rock drove Price and her family to relocate to Chicago permanently, and that's where she lived until her death in 1953. Now, as Price biographer Raylinda Brown and Samantha Ege have shown, Chicago's South Side in the 1920s and later was an extraordinarily active space for classical music making among its predominantly African American community. And it was in this environment that Price encountered Marian Anderson. And I want to comment briefly on Veronica's point earlier about these histories of classical music history and who might be overlooked. We often think about Chicago's South Side as being a hub of blues and jazz, but it was absolutely a hub of classical music making as well as classical dance and other art forms that we associate kind of intersect with classical music. And Price was involved in all of these poets, choreography, was just very active shortly after she moved. Now, Marian Anderson, her childhood was much different from Price's socially, but was just as rewarding musically. Her father, unlike Price's father, was a working class salesman at the Reading Terminal in Philadelphia, while her mother was a child care provider and had been barred from school teaching because she didn't have a college degree. Now, even so, Anderson and her Aunt Mary were very active participants in her church's musical life. And Dr. Alicia Jones has called this the musical academy of the church. And like Price, Anderson's musical talent was spotted at a young age. Through her church networks, Anderson was even able to make money as a teenage vocalist, but the costs of advanced formal instruction were often too prohibitive for her immediate family. So her local church organizations, and then later a Chicago-based group called the National Association of Negro Musicians, raised funds to award her a scholarship to the Chicago Conservatory of Music in the summer of 1919. And she eventually finished high school in 1921 in Philadelphia at the age of 24. So she's getting a little bit of a later start with things than Price did. Now, 4 years later, though, at around the same time that Price began submitting her work to composition contests, Anderson entered a singing competition in New York City that landed her a performance with the New York Philharmonic at Lewisohn Stadium. Now, it's hard to think of a more auspicious debut than in New York City with the New York Philharmonic. And this concert was a critical success that allowed her to retain the management services of a man named Arthur Judson, who was one of the country's most respected managers and at one time was managing both the Philadelphia Orchestra and the New York Philharmonic. He's a very powerful figure. So she started a tour shortly after this, and her itinerary included very prestigious venues like Carnegie Hall in 1928 and Chicago's Orchestra Hall in 1929. But pervasive racism in the classical music industry made sustaining this kind of domestic career very difficult. A lot of venues didn't want to host Black singers, and this certainly affected others like the great tenor Roland Hayes. So therefore, just at the time Price was coming into her own in Chicago, where she might have heard Anderson perform in 1929, Anderson accepted a Julius Rosenwald Fellowship to study in Europe before embarking on a continental tour in 1933, and these are the last two bullets here. Now, this tour was so successful in Europe that Anderson was able to retain even better management services upon returning to the United States in 1935, where she would remain for the next several years. And it was 1935, in fact, that Price and Anderson began their collaboration. Well, now that we know a little bit about who Price and Anderson were and where they landed by the mid-1930s, I want to show how the existing archival record demonstrates the depth of their relationship. At that time, both women were experiencing major transformation in their lives, as well as significant professional successes. In 1933, as you can see on the screen, when Anderson began her tour of Europe, back in the States, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, under the conductor Frederick Stock, premiered Price's award-winning symphony in E minor. prompting Price to compose several more large-scale orchestral works that include her piano concerto, a violin concerto, a tone poem. She was just very active in 1933 and 34, while Anderson was overseas in Europe. Now, I wish we had letters from that period, but unfortunately, only 2 letters from Price to Anderson survive in the Anderson collection at Penn. One from 1937, just after their relationship began, and one from 1944, around when they started to go their separate ways professionally. Now, limited as these letters are, they tell a remarkable story, and I want to share these with you. The letter from 1937 reads, "Dear Miss Anderson, enclosed are a few numbers you may care to look over. Please believe me that at the time I sent, through my daughter Edith, who is in Sacramento, California, my Go Down Moses arrangement, I did not know that you had already used Mr. Burley's arrangement. I am sure that you will understand and excuse it. I'm still eager for you to do the one you spoke to me about on your last visit to Chicago, the one which you said was in New York. Would you be interested in any other type of original songs? I am contemplating making an orchestration for symphonic orchestra for the My Soul's Been Anchored in the Lord. Yours truly, Florence B. Price." Now, the tone here is polite and almost formal. Price, a notorious introvert, is even apologetic for possibly stepping on Harry Burley's toes as an arranger of spirituals. Now, at the same time, we see Price being assertive enough to send Anderson several scores to review, likely spiritual arrangements, and to ask if Anderson wants any new original compositions. Now, the timing here is also important because Anderson had debuted Price's arrangement of My Soul's Been Anchored in the Lord during her European tour in 1935 and 1936. And I've seen here at the Anderson archive, there are programs from Denmark, Germany, Austria, Italy. I mean, everywhere that Anderson was going, she was singing this Price arrangement. And what this means is that she was giving Price an extraordinary amount of international exposure that was rare, even for the most famous white men American composers at the time. So that's Price's exposure in comparison. So by 1937, after Price had returned to the US, we can see in this letter that Price wasn't taking her support for granted and still wanted to cultivate this sisterly relationship. Now, for her part, as I mentioned, Anderson was cultivating this relationship admirably. Not long after she returned from Europe, she continued to perform My Soul's Been Anchored in the Lord on her domestic tour, including in Chicago in January 1936. And I surmise that this is when they were talking about more spirituals. Now, a month later, Anderson wrote Price a telegram from New York to say that she had just recorded the spiritual for the Victor Company and would send photos. So at that early date with this telegram, we can see the seeds of reciprocal support emerging, that Price was writing music for Anderson, and Anderson was using her venue and recording connections to give it as wide an audience as possible. In fact, Anderson continued to concertize with My Soul's Been Anchored in the Lord for several years after this. And as Dr. Alicia Jones has argued, Anderson even gave it pride of place on Anderson's notorious Easter concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1939. Some of you may know that this performance was a protest against the Daughters of the American Revolution's refusal to allow Anderson to perform in their concert hall on account of her race. As Dr. Jones noted, and I quote, "Anderson ascended the stage of Lincoln Memorial, voicing Florence B. Price's composition as the final say. On that landmark moment, the concert closed with this rousing spiritual." So while the 1937 letter gives us a shred of insight into this emerging relationship that blossomed into Anderson's championing of Price on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the 1944 letter reveals a more mature collaboration and friendship years in the making. It begins much more informally this time. "My dear friend, it was good to be spared to again hear you sing and to greet you briefly after overcoming to a large extent what seemed at the time to be a hopeless heart condition. I had hoped to have a few minutes to talk with you about the spirituals I am bound for the kingdom, and I'm working on my building. However, I could not bring myself to encroach upon your limited time by requesting it. As I contemplate submitting these two numbers to a publisher at some time, I wanted to ask if you would like any changes made in the manuscript, particularly, and I'm working on my building. I'm wondering if you would not like to end all for my Lord instead of all for my Lord, as used after the first verse, in case someday you might care to sing it. Now, in this remarkable communication, we see the composer at work alongside a star performer as they consider how the music should sound. Of course, throughout history, composers and performers have long worked together in a cooperative capacity, but we rarely see it. Normally, they would work side by side in the same room, leaving no trace of the encounter for historians to find later. But here, Price's characteristic shyness prevented her from demanding Anderson's time when they were both in Chicago to go over this issue. And she thought it would be best to write it all down instead. So I think that's extraordinary. But this letter doesn't stop there. Price goes on to explain for Anderson how her performances were having a positive financial impact for her. She wrote, "The sponsors of the Telephone Hour, which was an NBC radio show, have written me a most cordial letter in which they informed me that you have programmed I'm Bound for the Kingdom. Thank you. It was fine news because each broadcast of a composition of mine helps to maintain or advance my standing in ASCAP." Now, I'll say more about ASCAP in a second, but the letter continues by explaining that Price was willing to write more arrangements for Anderson. "With best wishes," she closes, "in which Florence and Edith join me for a joyous holiday season, I am yours sincerely, Florence B. Price." It's a much friendlier letter. It shows the closeness of their relationship, and it seals for us the sisterhood. Now, some of you may know that ASCAP, the American Society for Composers, Authors, and Publishers, is still one of the country's premier licensing agencies that helps pay creators for their work through licensing programs. Price joined ASCAP in 1950, becoming the first 1940, becoming the first African-American female member of the concert or classical division. And a memo found among Price's belongings in 2009 shows exactly how valuable Anderson's support was during this period. So this is the statement credit, and I've highlighted for you these numbers. So in 1942, ASCAP logged no credits, although that's a mistake. But these steadily increased from 100 in 1943 to the 300s by 1944 when Price wrote the letter. So clearly, this was Anderson's doing. And as we saw, the continued stream of royalties after Price's death that you see here in 1946, and it kind of trickles off in the 40s and 50s, but that's normal to have kind of highs and lows. But in the 1940s, when Anderson was releasing more records and doing more performances, it reaches this really high point. We can see that this stream of royalties captured here in this document helped send Price's grandchildren to college. So the triangulation between Price, Anderson, and ASCAP sustained both of their careers. But where I'd like to close my presentation is that this triangulation almost never happened. And this is a story that's still waiting to be told and that you'll hear now. So as I mentioned earlier, Price joined ASCAP in 1940. And it's easy to draw a straight line from Anderson's European performances of Price's music in 1935 to her American performances in the late 1930s to the culmination performance on the Lincoln Memorial Steps in 1939. We can say, well, Price joined ASCAP a year later and the rocket kicks into hyperdrive as Price starts receiving royalties on Anderson's performances and recordings in the 1940s. But, and this is a very sobering thought, Price had applied for membership to ASCAP in 1934, and the application wasn't approved until 1940, meaning she missed out on a full 6 years of royalties on Anderson's extensive performances throughout the late 1930s, during which time Anderson was concertizing throughout the world. Now, what happened? Here, the archives in Fayetteville and Philadelphia also fill in some gaps. On November 16th, 1934, the wealthy Chicago-based composer, a white man, John Alden Carpenter, wrote Price a short message in response to a question that she had asked him about the requirements for joining ASCAP. He wrote that he spoke to an ASCAP official who explained that the main requirements were 6 publications published by an ASCAP member, as well as a recommendation from a current member. He says here that Price's publisher was a member, which meant that she qualified. Well, Price immediately requested and filled out an application, and within a month's time, Carpenter himself served as her recommender. Well, tick-tock, tick-tock. Nearly 6 years later, on May 13th, 1940, John Alden Carpenter wrote a letter to Price that is now held at the University of Arkansas. This is worth reading. He wrote, "Thank you for your letter of May 8th. I'm sorry to hear that there has been no action as yet on your application for membership in ASCAP." And of course, I think to myself, it would have taken me 6 months to sort of rattling chains, but Price, very kind of conservative and shy, waited 6 years to start complaining. I will take it up with their office and see if I can get any information for you. Well, then this is where Anderson comes into the picture. He says, "You are certainly to be congratulated on the inclusion of one of your songs on Marian Anderson's programs, for it is undoubtedly one of the highest goals that any contemporary writer of songs can reach. I have not yet heard her sing your song, but hope to at the first opportunity." By way of reciprocity, the next time you see Miss Anderson, you might say to her that you know of an American composer by the name of Carpenter, who has been one of her sincerest admirers from afar for a long time, and who sent her about a year ago a group of his songs in the hope that they might interest her. I do not know if they actually reached her personally, but I still hope that they come to her attention and that she may be interested. It is gratifying to hear of your study progress. You know that I have always had the greatest interest in your work. With kindest regard, very sincerely yours, John Alden Carpenter. Now, we learn a lot from this brief letter. First, it's clear that ASCAP had stalled her application. We may never know why exactly, but the effect, as we have seen, was profound. Had her membership been processed quickly, she would have gained significant royalties from Anderson's 1930s performances and recordings. Second, we can see how Carpenter likely understood the sisterly nature of their relationship, and like the wealthy, entitled white man that he was, asked Price to intervene on his behalf, even though he was clearly more famous, wealthier, and far more likely to get Anderson's attention had she been white. Now, funny, Carpenter's letter from a year earlier had reached Anderson, and I looked into this. It can now be found in the Penn archives. He wrote, "Based on my great admiration and deep respect for your gifts, I am taking the liberty of asking my publishers to forward you some of my songs in the hope that they may interest you. The selection I have made is a varied one, ranging in the text all the way from Tagore to Langston Hughes, and includes the songs which have given me the most pleasure in writing. If you should feel moved to use some of these songs, I would have something to boast about to my grandchildren. With very best wishes, sincerely yours, John Alden Carpenter." Now, I could take another half hour to dig into how ironic I think this letter is, especially since Price's grandchildren certainly did get to benefit from Anderson's support of her music. But I will leave the dig to Price herself, who took Carpenter to task in her own letter to Anderson, written literally the day after she received Carpenter's request to touch base as a favor. You'll love this. She says, "Dear Miss Anderson, receiving compliments by this time has become such a habit that it has become boresome for you, no doubt. Yet I thought you would like to know of something said by a dyed-in-the-wool American, a direct descendant of John Alden, one of America's most outstanding composers, a man without prejudice, although he is a millionaire, quietly exerting far-reaching influence and power in the world of music, a close personal friend of just about all of our major symphony conductors, to say nothing of having through marriage joined his fortune with that of the former Mrs. Borden, herself a patroness of the arts. He is very decisive and outspoken in his likes and dislikes. I have seen some very important people all in a dither when he is around and about. By this time, you have probably guessed that I am referring to the globetrotter John Alden Carpenter, who today expressed to me all manner of fine things about you, saying that he had been one of your sincerest admirers from afar for a long time. I was proud and thrilled and felt that I must tell you about it and also quote from a letter of his. You are certainly to be congratulated on the inclusion of one of your songs in Miss Anderson's programs, for it is undoubtedly one of the highest goals that any contemporary writer of songs can reach. You can imagine how proud and thrilled I was to have him voice my own thoughts. And now my joy would be complete if I could witness his being bowled over by the breathtaking radiation of your poise, unaffected culture and sincerity that bowls over all who come in your presence. I would therefore like to present the great American composer to the world's greatest singer, and then stand back and revel in his well-concealed admiration for you. Do you think this can be accomplished on your next visit here? Could you give us a few minutes at your hotel, perhaps?" Well, 2 days later, after writing this letter, Price wrote back to Carpenter in a very different, more formal tone. "Dear Mr. Carpenter, I shall certainly bring to Miss Anderson's attention your songs on her next visit to Chicago. If you would care to also meet Mr. Anderson personally, it would give me great pleasure to try and arrange it. Maybe it might be well to then hand her some more of your song manuscripts, just in case the others did not reach her. I have an idea that she might like especially to look over new and untried things. If this suggestion is not to your liking or convenience, I should be glad to personally hand her any songs entrusted to my care. Very sincerely yours." Again, what's remarkable here is the contrast between her wink-wink tone with Anderson about who Carpenter was and how they might engage with one another, and her sincere business-like tone with Carpenter. And the plan worked. Within a matter of weeks, if not days, ASCAP approved her application for membership. And what's more, she immediately started receiving inquiries from major publishers to print the new art song that Anderson had been concertizing, the one that she told Carpenter about, that she had been singing throughout the winter and spring seasons of that year, including at Carnegie Hall. This was a setting of Langston Hughes's beautiful Songs to the Dark Virgin. And within a year's time, G. Schirmer published it, and Price could begin receiving royalties on it as it became one of her most popular numbers, thanks to Anderson's championing. So it was this combination of her sisterhood with Anderson and her slight manipulation of Carpenter that got this ball rolling. So to close briefly, I'd like to offer a reflection on what we've seen. First, I love thinking about how Price's and Anderson's worlds collided at a moment when they were both on the rise in their respective domains. We probably all wish we could have been flies on the wall when they were in conversation with each other, when they might have been composing together. But we only know some of this based on what they wrote to each other in letters. But unfortunately, we live our lives in conversation, and so we may never know what they actually thought and did. It's clear, though, just from these letters, that these two women had deep mutual affection for one another, professionally and personally, and that this affection extended very deeply across generations. It even helped Price's daughter sustain with strength through a difficult period in her life. Second, these few archival records show precisely how the two women sharing these sisterly bonds navigated the tough situation of Price's stalled application to ASCAP. Price used Carpenter's desire to connect with Anderson as leverage to get him to push her application through. Then, once Price had been admitted, Anderson went into high gear over the next several years, as we saw on the ASCAP statement, to help Price make up for lost time. That's not just what friends do, it's what sisters do, making this a true Philadelphia story. Thank you. Now I'm hoping that we may have some questions, discussion, and if there's desire, I have a recording of songs to the Dark Virgin in case we want to have a little bit of music at some point. So I know this is a very historical presentation and storytelling, but always good to have music at a musical presentation.
Absolutely,
Thank you,
absolutely.
everyone.
Thank you so much. That was so insightful and wonderful. And what I really appreciate is that we often forget that sometimes these composers and artists have very deep relationships, and it's a very involved process. Many people may know that Opera Philadelphia has a longstanding practice of our composer in residence program. And when you were showing some of the back and forth between the two women and showing like little sketches of like, maybe we'll go this way, maybe we'll go that way, it kind of reminded me of some of the conversations I've been a fly on the wall to when it comes to the way in which some of our composer in residence have kind of created their pieces, like Renee Orth, doing workshops and trying to figure out what's the best way to utilize the voice of the singer. And so I think that you have given us really great insight and peek into their particular relationship. So thank you.
Yeah, and very quickly, I'll note that in some of the manuscripts that, so real quick, I mentioned that Price sent Anderson about 50 of her songs in all. So there's a huge collection of Price's songs that remain with the Anderson papers in Philadelphia. Well, Price had her own copies of some of these songs, and in a few of them, she even has in like sometimes red or blue pencil, her original marking will be in black, and then in red or blue she will renotate and have a note that says this is how Marian Anderson sings it. And so she was even willing to have Marian Anderson sing it kind of in her own way and even record it in her own way, and in Price's own note keeping would say like this is how I wanted it, but I'm going to let Marian do it her way. And she would note so that other people who ask, she could have it on hand to say, well, this is how Marian does it. So I love that you can even see that Price was keeping track of Anderson's work even on her own manuscript. So you're exactly right that composers they get energy from how performers take their music in different directions sometimes, and I just love that we can see that firsthand with these documents. It's so great.
It's fantastic. And it actually leads me to like one of the things that also comes to mind is that you started your presentation talking about how many of these files and artifacts were found in someone's house. And so I'm curious, like, how does that kind of it seems like all of the pieces are in different places. All of the archival pieces are in different places. How does that affect the being able to do scholarship around Florence Price?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is a long scholarly and history writing practice, you might say, that really goes back over 100 years of working on the history of Black musicians of the African diaspora, that is this kind of puzzle piece strategy, because people of the African diaspora, and this is well known, this is not news to anyone, are often not affiliated with that routinely left major archival documents. So for instance, if there's many universities not only didn't admit Black students, but didn't have Black faculty. And so if there was, say, someone who was educated at a segregated school that now no longer exists because it was maybe folded into the white organization in the 50s or something, and it just sort of lost its institutional history, then figuring out the dimensions of that person's life, excuse me, can be very difficult because there's no paper trail. And so that was often true of Price as well, that especially these first 15 years of her professional life when she was living in Little Rock and Atlanta, there are just very few archival traces because A, she was working out of the home a lot of the time, and people don't leave institutional records of their home lives, or they throw them away. I mean, like we throw stuff, like we throw our restaurant receipts away, I mean, whatever it is. So we don't know much about her day-to-day life at all. But fortunately, in Price's case, she was of a social class where the activities of groups that she was a part of were often reported on in the Black press. And so there are even some reports in the Chicago Defender in the 19-teens of Price being in Chicago because she had, this is kind of a random fact, but she had this wealthy uncle who was a prominent lawyer in Chicago, who was a part of musical organizations. And so you can find newspaper reports about Price and her family and the other sort of social circles that she was a part of, even before she moves to Chicago, in the Black press. And so we can't think about necessarily these institutional connections, but if you start to think outside the box about how Price might have left physical traces, then these puzzle pieces start to come together. The other dimension of this that's really different about Price than a lot of other composers is that Price was often giving her scores as gifts to other people. And so the children and grandchildren of these individuals that Price gave scores to have started sending their scores to other libraries now to be preserved in perpetuity. And so there are scores at the Center for Black Music Research of Price's that came to them in 2003, 2011, and the University of Arkansas even got a new batch in, I want to say, December of 2022. So there are still like new things coming out of the woodwork that are a reflection of Price's proclivity to send things out. And so, yeah, to research Black musicians in general requires a kind of puzzle piece mentality because of a relative lack of institutional connection. But then in Price's case in particular, she had some personal habits to mail stuff out and give stuff out that makes it even more kind of, I mean, for me, as like, I love this. It's fun to sort of figure out the mysteries, but to kind of get who would she be thinking about, who was in her network, and many other scholars are working on this too. And so we kind of think through, okay, if we can find this grandchild, maybe there's something out there that will be new. So it's always it's super cool that there's an amazing amount of material that became available in a relatively concentrated form at this house. But it's been extra cool to see even more stuff emerge over the past few years. Yeah, and so it's I feel like the work on Price will just continue to be new and fresh for a long time into the future because it's telling these stories requires just a different kind of thinking about the record. And I'll close my response to this by pointing out that, say, someone like Aaron Copland or Leonard Bernstein, a huge amount of their material, just an exhaustive amount of material, can be found at the Library of Congress. Like you go to one place and it's like it's all there. I mean, it's not every little thing, but in terms of percentages, it's just so much higher than what the University of Arkansas has about Price. And so if you want to do something comprehensive on Price, you have to go to a ton of places. Whereas, you can write major biographies of someone like Bernstein or Copland going to the one spot.
Thanks for that. That's very striking. The need to go to multiple places. to research one very important composer within the Philadelphia, but also national conversation around composing and American music, and then to research another person who is also equally important. You only need to go to one place.
Yeah, yeah, and sorry to interject. Just one immediate thought that I have as a consequence, and this is relevant for the attendees, is that when Price entered the national stage with national media in 2018, there were some reports in the New York Times, the New Yorker, and many other venues, and then she got a publishing deal with Shermer through her heirs. There was so much demand for biographical information about Price, but because of this challenge in putting the sources together, the scholars, and I mentioned them in my paper, but there are others as well, who were already working on Price. We've all for several years just been like, slow down, slow down. Like, we need time to figure out like even basic things. And I'll just point out that one of these is the year in which she was born. Many sources for a long time thought it was 1888, and then some people thought 1887. Well, now some of us really believe that it was 1888, that people were right all along. And so even like what you put on the program in parentheses for Price's dates, even that's a challenge to figure out because of the conflicting sources and there not being a single kind of, definitive way of looking at it. So yeah, in terms of communicating with audiences, has been tricky. And Price, as you mentioned, has all of these great stories about her life, and she was very important. But just figuring out how to be accurate, how to be sensitive to her life story is a challenge. Whereas, with Beethoven, people were writing Beethoven biographies while he was still alive. So there is literally a 200-year history of Beethoven biography writing. And with Price, we've got about 45 at this point. Like, give us some time.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, I don't see any questions in either the chat or the Q&A. And so I am wondering if maybe we might close out this lecture with a little bit of your musical presentation that you had available. But before we do that, I want to say thank you so much for this lecture. It has been wonderful. I have learned some things, and I find it really, like I said before, really wonderful to see the connection between these two individuals. Some people may be wondering, why are we talking about Florence Price, and why are we connecting with the International Florence Price Festival as Opera Philadelphia? And I just want to let you know that this series of lectures and this collaboration is actually because of a multi-year initiative that we call Sounds of America, Price and Bonds. And for Opera Philadelphia, this began with our presentation of Margaret Bonds's Credo in the Academy for our last season. So it was 22-23 season. If you're interested in learning more about the Sounds of America initiative and our partners that are a part of that initiative, which International Florence Price Fest is one of them, you can check out the link in the chat. My colleague has dropped it in there. Thank you very much. We do have 2 more lectures in this series. We have one next Thursday, and for more information, you are able to go to the Opera Philadelphia website. You will see Sounds of America lectures at noon. It's an event page, and my colleague will drop that link in the chat as well. But I'm going to actually turn it over to you, Dr. Shadle, to finish us out with a musical selection. And thank you again for your wonderful
thank you so much. And I appreciate you talking about these larger projects that you're doing, because speaking as a board member of the Price Festival, I mean, and as I mentioned earlier, we have just long believed that Opera Philadelphia is really paving new ground for how a major classical music and arts organization changes the culture. I mean, part of my lecture is about a culture that was very exclusionary, and that is historically how our sphere has been. But Price Fest and Opera Philadelphia are both, I think, making significant strides at just, interrupting those cycles. And, it's not only with the programming on the physical stage, but it's how do we engage with the community? How do we talk? How do we tell stories about this art, and how do we share the kaleidoscopic reality behind this art making. So I just thank you so much on behalf of not only me, but also my colleagues at PriceFest for this larger collaboration. So as Veronica mentioned, I'll close out with a performance of Songs to the Dark Virgin, one of the pieces that Anderson performed in the late 40s, and it's about 3 minutes, so we'll close out right on the hour. And perhaps a bit provocatively, I've chosen a performance from Hamburg, Germany, because the reality of Price advocacy now is that she is taking the international stage by storm. And so I want to just show that Anderson, who was very successful in Europe, it's now coming full circle where European performers are now engaging very deeply with Price, and I think putting on very convincing performances. So here is Songs to the Dark Virgin performed by a duo in Hamburg, Germany. And of course, I forgot to share sound, so I'm going to, oh, there it is. Okay, I did. All right, so here we go. Songs to the Dark Virgin.
Would that I were a jewel, a shattered jewel, that all my shining brilliance might fall at thy feet, thou dark one. Would that I were a garment, a shimmering silken garment, that all my faults might remove thy body, absorb thy body, hold and hide thy body, thou dark Would that I were a flame, but one sharp gleaming flame, to annihilate thy body, thou
What a beautiful close. And thanks to everyone for being here, for your attention. Of course, thanks again to Veronica and Opera Philadelphia for this opportunity to share.
Great. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you again.